welcome to my channel where we discuss anything and everything to do with mental health and psychology. This video is the second part of KSA number 7. Everything that's documented, whether that's in MDT meetings or whether that's between you and a service user or you and a family member, always make sure that that is documented. And that's a key sign of effective communication, because you're not only communicating with the service user, the family or the MDT, it's also communicated to anyone else that, let's say, involved in that person's care in the future, or involved in that person's care after you or during your time with them too. So if you do referrals to other organisations or other teams, then they're aware of anything that's happening, and it might be something that might be relevant to come back to. So that's why it's important to make sure that they're accurate and relevant, because it's going to affect the care decisions, and someone might go back to what you've written and say, oh, okay, this is what happened there. And if it's not accurate, it could have implications for the person's care. That also comes back to you reading other people's notes, because that's part of the communication process. So you put on, and documentation is your communication to others, but you also read from others, and that is a important thing to have as a professional, is that you need to be almost like in the routine of reading documentation and knowing where to go for information. For example, if you're a healthcare assistant, you might need to read nursing assessments or doctor's assessments for information, and you might need to read other people's daily notes. For example, CPA meetings you might need to read about, or any other documentation that you might need to read about, just to provide that consistency of care. So you might say something like, for example, reading documentation, reading assessments helped me to understand clients, their potential risks, their triggers, their histories, experiences, and also their strengths and positive experiences. So if someone's key working with a service user or a client, then you might actually need to know that information. So what are their strengths? What are their positive experiences? So when they are distressed, you know the things to put in place, or care plans. So you know, okay, what is the plan of action? So you're providing a continuity of care. My next point is one that I've briefly touched on already, but is addressing barriers, and that might be language, culture and cultural sensitivity. I think even in the last few years, there's been a lot more focus on being culturally sensitive and culturally aware. And this is particularly important in mental health, because especially ethnic minorities, or I don't like the term ethnic minorities, but I don't also like the term BAME. So, because I feel like it's so minimalist, not minimalist, minimizing experiences, basically. But other cultures, and being aware of the barriers within those cultures, stigmas, taboos within those cultures, are important to understand. And I think here would be an important place to highlight, if you've had any training on cultural awareness, anything to help you become more culturally sensitive or culturally aware, especially mental health within different hard to reach communities. I think that will be amazing to address here, because there's a way that you can address barriers. I know going on trainings, going to seminars, it can never give you the same experience of someone who is actually living within that culture. Does that make sense? So, for example, if you're not South Asian, you might not know what it's like to be South Asian. But then let's say you're a South Asian male, you might not know what it's like to be a South Asian woman. Does that make sense? Or I will never know what it's like to be a South Asian male, even though we're the same culture. Does that make sense? Because everyone's experiences of that culture are different. So, for example, I will never know what it's like to be South Asian within Pakistan, even though that's where I'm from. The same way I won't ever know what it's like to be a black woman, because that's not what I am, but I can work on myself to be able to address that barrier and educate myself. Does that make sense? So if you've been on any training programs, any reading you've done, I think that's really important to highlight here, and I feel like that's what's going to make this essay stand out. Especially if you're aware of, let's say, your own culture. So if you're an ethnic minority, I would put that in here. So taboos, appropriateness, because some things are appropriate for one culture and not appropriate for another culture. The way things are communicated, the meanings attached to things, the descriptions attached to things, gender issues. But then you also have to highlight, even if you are from this culture, that, like I mentioned a few seconds ago, that everyone's experiences of the culture is different, depending on your age, your gender, and your sexuality. Your experience of that culture will be different. And then it's important to highlight that too. So there's no broad, almost like thing that you can put in place for you to be able to, okay, that bit is covered. Does that make sense? So it won't, you will still get to know the individual and what they prefer, what they don't prefer, and ask them what their culture is. Because there's been many occasions where service users have assumed I was part of their culture, or part of their religion when I haven't been. And then it's important to highlight that, yes, I can understand, for example, assuming that I'm Indian, or I'm Hindu, or I'm Sikh. It's that the assumption's there and I have an understanding of those cultures and those religions, but I can't know what it's like. So you can ask them, okay, tell me what it's like. And even if you have an experience, for example, and this could be one of your examples if you want it to be, is that if you've had someone who's been the same culture as you, and there's been a difference where you didn't understand their culture and you went out of your way to almost like ask them about their culture. Oh, what does that mean? Yeah, so I have a bit of understanding about that. Why don't you tell me your experiences of that? Does that make sense? Or if you're part of a different culture, how you went about learning about that culture. Does that make sense? This also comes in to your communication. So once you understand their culture, and become culturally sensitive and gain an awareness of what's appropriate, not appropriate for them, you can also find a way where it's, how is my communication appropriate for them? Does that make sense? And then how do I interpret their communications to me? Does that make sense? So it is making that communication, like effective communication, a lot deeper. So expressing empathy in a culturally appropriate manner, modifying your behaviour or language where it's culturally appropriate. Does that make sense? So if someone's talking about, let's say, one that I've come across this week has been not wanting to talk about mental health with older generations or families or parents because they don't understand. It's that you need to acknowledge there's not just that it's a struggle for young people to communicate hard emotions anyway, but there's also cultural barriers and cultural taboos about discussing these topics. So it's not just a matter of, oh, okay, you build trust with your parent and you're able to communicate that. Does that make sense? It's almost a sense of knowing that how your parents will react, because it's something that's, let's say, for example, I'm going to talk about South Asian culture because that's the one I'm more familiar with, or Pakistani culture, is that those topics are taboo anyway. So you might know that, okay, if I discuss this with my mom, or if I discuss this with my dad, that he won't understand or she won't understand. Does that make sense? So it's also about knowing those barriers and learning the complexities of what someone's communicating. So it's not just it's hard to communicate, it's to family, it's that, okay, there's cultural limitations and barriers in place, and having an understanding of that. Does that make sense? So acknowledging that those aren't barriers that you can adapt. Well, you can adapt to, but you can't really address those barriers because they're more systemic issues that aren't easily solved, if that makes sense. This nicely comes on to my next point, which is make sure that information that you share with family or other organisations is consented to. And that applies to young people too. If there's something in therapy or there's something within their care that they don't want to tell their parents, there's still confidentiality there, and the age doesn't take away from that. And that's backed up by legislation. So when you are communicating with family, make sure that it's appropriate and is consented to, and that you're maintaining confidentiality throughout. So even if, for example, you're working in an inpatient and someone calls up the phone and says, oh, okay, is this person, has this person been admitted to this ward? You can't say yes or no. Because either way, even if you say no, that's still communicating something. But then also acknowledging that for some people, families are an important part of their support system. So communicating elements with consent and maintaining their confidentiality where they want it to be confidential with the family can actually reduce the family's distress and acknowledge their distress, and you can give them information that's broad and support them without having to breach confidentiality. And that's something you pick up with experience. So if you know how to do that, use it as an example. It could reduce confusion and it can empower them to manage the person's mental health when they take them home. And I use the term family loosely here because I know a lot of people don't have conventional families, so it can be their group of friends, or it's whoever provides them that support, and that's part of their support bubble. Does that make sense? Also, going back to when you're talking about diversity, if you're multilingual, I would mention that in there too. The languages you speak, anytime that you've been useful, or your experiences of addressing barriers by communicating in a language that other than English that you speak. It's also, for example, if you're aware of different dialects, so if you're good at hearing different dialects of English, or if you speak different languages and different dialects of that language, or if you understand slang and you're very familiar with slang, that could also add to your ability to communicate effectively. Also, it's important if you are from a population that is a minority, obviously term used loosely and just used because I can't think of another word. If you have a more appropriate word that you feel like is more person of colour. Okay, so if person of colour is okay to say, Okay, I'm just going to use person of colour because I feel like, okay. Anyway, so if you are a person of colour or you have experience of working with people of colour, then I would also highlight that. Also because people of colour are known to have more barriers to accessing mental health, and they're often hard to reach populations. And I don't want to use just people of colour because I feel that other groups come into this as well. Okay, I'm just going to use a person of colour / minorities. They're all hard to reach groups. So because they're harder to reach, it adds a benefit to you having experience with them or being part of that group. Does that make sense? Also know that a lot of people who access our services, English is not their first language. So if you have skills and qualities that you think are relevant to talking to people whose English is not their first language, you can put that here. And if you're talking about personal experiences, so I spoke about personal experiences because most of my family English is not their first language, or they struggle to speak English. So if you have experience or you have the skills and qualities, because you have to acknowledge that not all people want to have translators, and it takes them longer to communicate what they need to communicate, but it's about having that patience, being genuine and making the person feel comfortable in being able to communicate what they need to communicate. For example, in this, I use my mum as an example where she can speak English but she struggles to, and actually having that patience and making her feel comfortable and giving her the time to be able to speak will encourage her to speak. Does that make sense? Because you can't just assume, oh yeah, she wants a translator. Does that make sense? So having patience, being empathetic, being able to support and make the person feel comfortable in communicating or finding the words, because it might just be, in some cases, even when you are confident in the language, and I found this personally in my experience too, is that sometimes because some questions that people ask you, you've never thought about or you've never been able to articulate. So finding the words is difficult to do. So you also need to, so it ties into each other. So this comes into my next point, which is having the ability to facilitate effective communication from others is part of effective communication. And that's through your body language, your general demeanour, your paralanguage, basically. So your tone of voice, your things that are not explicitly said, can help someone either communicate or can help them close back up. So here I would highlight the qualities and the skills that you have to help people to be able to communicate. And that's a communication on the part of your paralanguage. So what can you do with your body language? What can you do with your tone of voice? What can you do? Anything that's not verbal to facilitate that communication. And what can you do verbally to facilitate that communication and help the person feel understood, safe, and help them feel supported in being able to communicate what they need to communicate. My next point is managing communication and managing group dynamics, which can be really important, especially when you become a therapist, managing groups of people, managing MDTs, managing group therapies, and managing families. Acknowledging and being aware of the changing group dynamics and how each individual contributes to a group, and being able to formulate that in your head. So build an understanding of that within your mind and the way one person impacts the dynamics and that one person's role within that. And that could also be how you manage conflict. So with you and another person, and with you and a group of people. So shouting, verbal abuse, challenging behaviour, aggression, violence, acknowledging all those things, whether that's verbal violence, physical violence, aggression, how that's communicating something, and how can you begin to understand that. And if you have an example of, let's say, a service user or a staff member or anyone getting angry, and how you de-escalate that situation, because verbally should always be the best way, if that's safe and possible to do, and how you got, because someone's communicating a need, right? Because no one becomes angry for no reason. It's a need they're trying to communicate, and how would you go about de-escalating that situation, verbally or with your body language? Does that make sense? Or with both? Within a group dynamic, how would you communicate rules and guidelines for the group? What you would do is explain the rationale and have a strong rationale for these rules and have them clearly written somewhere where it's visible. Does that make sense? So that's like written communication, but then also verbal when you're giving them the rationale. So the example that I used was of how I managed a discussion of a sensitive topic, and how I managed conflict, dealt with the sensitive topic itself, and how my awareness of the individuals within the group, sort of what I explained in my earlier point, my awareness of individuals in the group and what the individuals were going through, and awareness of the contribution individuals had, and then also my awareness of paralanguage and how my awareness of different ways to communicate. So, for example, body language contributed to my understanding of and my interpretation of the situation. Does that make sense? So other participants communicate their discomfort not by verbally saying it, but I could tell from the body language that they were uncomfortable with the sensitive topic that was brought up. I also spoke about my confidence in my ability to discuss the sensitive topic and manage the conflict. Because I think if I didn't have that confidence and that ability and the skills, I would have managed it in a very different way rather than actually bringing myself forward and exploring it. And then managing conflict with my confidence in my therapeutic relationship with that person and my ability to de-escalate situations verbally. Does that make sense? But then I also read the situation, which brings me onto that para-language point. Adapting my language, being aware of the group dynamics during and after, and my awareness of the individuals in that group, and having that therapeutic relationship. I know I repeated some of those points. But that gives you an awareness of my example that I used, because I feel like it covered a lot of the points that I had made earlier. This brings me on to another point, which is the confidence, ability and skills to communicate sensitive topics that are emotive and challenging, which is, as a therapist, is part and parcel of the job, and emotive and challenging topics is basically what you work with. But having the skills and the ability to be creative, be able to communicate, being able to manage the communication of others, and being able to manage the communication and the feelings that come up for yourself is an important part of managing the sensitive topics, the conflicts even, and the challenging topics that you're going to talk about. Does that make sense? So being able to deal with the difficult things that are communicated, the emotions of other people, encouraging them to communicate, creating that safe environment, which links back to having the skills and the ability. So empathy, creating a safe environment, communicating that sense of safety, non-judgment, support. And like, for example, normally people won't say judgmental things. Normally it's their facial expressions or the small changes in body language that indicate, okay, this person is judging me or this person had a reaction to what I've said. Does that make sense? But it's really important to, as a therapist, to be neutral. Does that make sense? And not be, because sometimes that when people act in shock, or sometimes they act, you can tell when someone's upset, right? You're working with distressing and challenging things. So how are you going to manage that for yourself? And in that moment, be there for that person and communicating that. Does that make sense? And I don't think this is a necessary part. This is just an extra part to show that you're able to communicate. And then again, you can talk about managing this within a group. But one of the main difficulties people have is difficult emotions and challenging emotions. So how would you, for example, help someone communicate those? You might use a traffic light system where they can communicate risk. So red, the urge is very strong. Amber, the urge is growing, but it's manageable, so I need a distraction. Does that make sense? Obviously, these cards can mean different things, but it's a traffic light system to be able to communicate something that's difficult for the person to be able to communicate. For example, you can also have emoji cushions. So a person can hold a cushion that they feel applies to them. They can select an emoji. For example, if you're facilitating communication between you and someone else, or you're doing a mood chart, you might want, especially with young people, they might feel more comfortable relating to an emoji rather than relating to a word emotion, if that makes sense. To be able to put those interventions in place, what you actually need to do is have an awareness of the person, develop that therapeutic relationship, develop that open communication, and that's what's going to make you effective at communicating and effective at but all of these points are done on the foundation of a therapeutic relationship. So the ability to communicate, empathy, to communicate support, to communicate in a way that is simple and effective. Because if you're going to communicate with, let's say for example, clinical language, it's going to create a separation. Does that make sense? It makes it, even though it is effective for professionals who share that language, it's not going to be effective with people who don't understand that language. It makes things more overwhelming, more confusing, and it just almost builds a wall instantly, because it's, oh, okay, we're going through so much, and even using that language, so we're going through, or we're going to go through, or just using that togetherness language facilitates that collaborativeness, which also facilitates communication. Does that make sense? So the main theme that goes throughout this essay is that communication is more than just verbal. It's an interaction between your verbal, non-verbal communications, your paralanguage, but also the communication of others. And this is written, it's face-to-face, it's through so many different modes, and it also emphasizes the importance of that awareness and being able to read other people's body language as well as what they're saying verbally. Because sometimes what people say verbally and what they communicate physically can be different and can be sometimes even opposites of each other. And after completing the self-statement, I illustrated my 2 examples very specifically and highlighted them on their own. So example 1 and example 2. My first example I already went through, which was group dynamics and how I dealt with conflict and a sensitive topic. And my second example was communication within an MDT with different professionals. So, or a handover with different professionals. So how I adapted my language even between, so the point of clinical jargon between different professionals. Does that make sense? And that was my 2 examples. So use 2 examples that illustrate your point well and cover a lot of the points that we mentioned, or any points that you think of for your essay. Just to include them all, or as many as possible. It might not try to cover them all, but you might not think of an example, but try and cover multiple points that you've made within that example and highlight it well. And that's it for the video, guys. Hopefully you found this video useful, and as usual, if you have any comments, questions or concerns, please leave them down in the comments. And if you found this video useful, you think other people might find it useful, you know, you could share it. Yeah, like, comment, subscribe, all of that good stuff. Anyway, I shall see you in the next video.